All right, we'll get going, and if anyone joins, they can miss the little bit of introduction here. So, welcome to the CTS Transportation Planning and Economy Research Council meeting with our presentations on strategies for enhancing rural community transit. I'm Lisa Austin, and I am the chair of the council, and I work at MnDOT, and I'm the director of the Center for Community Connections. So a little background on the councils. Uh, there's several councils and they provide a forum for transportation professionals and researchers to exchange information on current transportation issues and trends. It's an important chance for practitioners and the academics to meet each other and talk about things. It brings together the university faculty and staff with practitioners from the public and private sectors to recommend direction and participate in improving the center's research, education, and engagement efforts. And you can see we've got a little description of the councils right there on the screen. In today's webinar, we'll have presentations from two folks giving two examples on how to enhance transit in rural communities. The first example is how a city could leverage its underutilized transportation assets and its underemployed transportation personnel as a community-based and on-demand system. And the second is a MnDOT project that focuses more on technology and how we can bring technology to public transit agencies. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Paul Morris, who is my vice chair and is going to be co-hosting this meeting with me today. So Paul, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and go through some logistics.
Great. Thank you, Lisa, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here. My name is Paul Morris. I'm a transportation engineer at SRF, where I lead our policy and system studies. I'm also a University of Minnesota graduate from the master's program at civil engineering and very enthusiastic supporter of CTS for many years, going back as a student and many research conferences and council presentations since then. Just to cover a couple housekeeping items here today, we do look forward to hearing your questions and comments on the presentation. If you'd like to offer any, please use the raise hand feature so we can unmute you, or you're welcome to enter those in the Q&A at any time. We will be monitoring those throughout the presentation, and we'll find opportunities to pose those questions to our presenters here today. We also want to note that this event is eligible for professional education credits, so both for AICPs and PEs. If you need that, please follow the instructions by putting that information in the chat, and we can follow up with that information here. We also want to notify you about some upcoming CTS events here. Both of these are free to attend. Just next week, on Tuesday, May 7th, we'll have another webinar called The Impact of Speed Limit Changes on Urban Streets. And the very next day on May 8th, another webinar about autonomous technology in transportation maintenance operations. So this is kind of a busy season for all the councils here as they're sharing out some of the information during the spring season, and we really hope you'll take advantage. I can imagine it doesn't hurt that PE renewal time is coming up too, so a way to make sure you're getting all your credits in advance of that. Lastly, we do want to express interest in all the students that are attending here. We do like to keep track of students that are joining today. If you are currently a student, please enter your information in the chat window, and the CTS staff will record that to make sure we have a record and are keeping in touch with students here. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Lisa to introduce our speakers.
Very good. Well, I'm going to be impressed if there's any students here today. I think it's finals week, right? So hopefully there are a few, because this is good information for students to learn about the real world and what practitioners are interested in. So first, I just want to introduce a few people from CTS. And as Paul was saying, CTS is an amazing resource, and they do so much to support research and make our jobs as chairs of this council very easy. First, I'd like to introduce Gina Boss and Sam Honduville and James DeSoto. And they are on the call here today, and are joining us from CTS. So this webinar will feature 2 presentations focused on enhancing public transit in rural communities. So Tom Fisher will describe how research at the university's design center worked with leadership in Wabasha, Minnesota, to elevate how the city could leverage its underutilized transportation assets and underemployed transportation personnel as a community-based on-demand transit system. As part of this effort, Tom's team looked at how people are finding transportation through informal and social media channels, explored how the city could support and enhance that activity, and identified the regulatory risks and barriers to fully using transportation assets that exist in small rural communities. When he was describing some of the research, it reminded me of the informal network I used when I was at the U, going down to the basement of Kaufman Memorial Union and looking at the bulletin board and saying, oh, look, somebody's going to Duluth and I need to go to Duluth next weekend. So I'm looking forward to hear about the modern informal networks that Tom discovered in his research. Our second presentation today will be from Elliott McFadden. He'll highlight a MnDOT project with mobility as a service. This one focuses on how the agency is bringing a MaaS technology to rural public transit agencies and their riders. Like I said before, that one really focuses on technology, and we got a little preview on some of the things they're talking about, and some of the work Elliott's doing is very exciting. So the webinar is held in conjunction with the CTS Transportation Planning and the Economy meeting. And one other thing to point out about CTS is every year there's a theme, and this year's theme is Rural Needs, Statewide Answers, Improving Transportation for All. So you can see our topics today fit that really well. Rural needs and some of the things that both Tom and Elliott talk about definitely can be implemented anywhere in the state, in urban or rural areas. So a little bit more about our speakers. Tom Fisher is the director of the Minnesota Design Center at the University of Minnesota. He specializes in design thinking and systems designs, including transportation systems and transportation-related land use and zoning. His current work focuses on infrastructure and community impacts of autonomous vehicles, mobility services, and the sharing economy, as well as the land use, transportation, and living and working impacts of pandemics. And I'll just note that I do have a design degree from the University of Minnesota. That was the design program was merged with architecture. I didn't go to the same version of the design center now, but I do have a design degree from the university. So it's nice to have Tom here, and I've known Tom for years. Elliott McFadden is the Greater Minnesota Shared Mobility Coordinator at MnDOT's Office of Transit and Active Transportation. In his role, he leads efforts to pilot and scale shared mobility services with public transit partners in rural and small urban communities in Greater Minnesota. He currently manages MnDOT's Moving Greater Minnesota Forward program and the first and only shared mobility innovation incubator in the nation to focus on the unique needs of rural, tribal, and small urban communities. He also leads MnDOT's regional mobility as a service project in partnership with FTA. And I used to be a colleague in the Office of Transit with Elliott, so I've also known him for years and glad to have him here as well. All right, so with that, I think, Tom, you're going to kick us off here, so I'll let you get going with your presentation. So thanks.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lisa. Let me share my screen here. Here, just a minute. So as Lisa said, I direct the Minnesota Design Center, and we do a lot of work in rural communities around the state. In fact, we're currently working with the CTS on a really exciting state-funded project called Empowering Small Minnesota Communities, where we're working with small communities around the state to help level the playing field in terms of their ability to compete for IIJA and IRA federal funding, as well as bonding requests and other sources of funding for them. And so I think we all feel really strongly that the University of Minnesota has an obligation to the entire state, and that as an anchor institution in the state, there's a lot that we can do to help greater Minnesota communities be more competitive. And as we'll talk about in a minute, we actually think that there's the potential for a lot of innovation in greater Minnesota, in part because some of the things that work, for example, around transit in urban and suburban areas don't work in smaller rural communities. And we see that as an opportunity to develop new ways of doing things. So as Lisa said, we will I'll largely talk about this project, Rural Community Transit Strategies, Building Upon, Expanding and Enhancing Existing Assets. This was just the lead up to the front page of the report. My colleagues, Mary Vogel, Alariza Kani, and Fernando Berga were also the co-PIs on it, and it was funded by MnDOT. And but I also am going to talk at the very end about another project that we have recently completed with MnDOT support as part of the Go Marty project in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. So there are really two projects in greater Minnesota that I want to talk about. And but I'll mainly focus on this one. This is just some of the table of contents, just to show what we did, which is we really focused on the informal ways that many greater Minnesota communities are leveraging to meet transit needs. So we're looking at how software and social media play a role. We're looking at volunteer programs, a lot of sharing economy strategies around sharing vehicles, sharing bikes, sharing other forms of mobility in rural communities. And then some of the regulatory barriers that have gotten in the way in terms of the innovations that we think are possible with rural transit, and then ended with a series of recommendations. So I will just give you in this talk just sort of a highlight of some of those chapters. Before I do, though, I just want to also just remind us of how much change is happening in transportation. I really love this image of the last big paradigm shift in transportation as we move from horse-drawn vehicles to automobiles. The image on the left, 1900, there's one car on Fifth Avenue in New York, and just 13 years later, there's one horse on Fifth Avenue in New York. In other words, this shows that the changes that happen in transportation systems don't just happen gradually over many, many decades. They actually reach tipping points and can change relatively quickly. And I want to make an argument in this talk that we are in the midst of another paradigm shift, where we are in the process of taking another animal, as we did the horse, out of our transportation system, and that animal is us. And just as sort of a context for this image, I think, kind of captures a lot of what our thinking is at the center and the kind of the work that we see going forward in our research, but also the kind of future that we're all headed toward, where we've been for the last 120 years in this lower left of individually owned driver-operated vehicles. We now know that we also have an increasing number of public shared driver-operated vehicles, the Uber Lyft mobility as a service model. Sorry about that. And we're probably at some point heading toward the right-hand side of this. There may, in fact, be individually owned autonomous vehicles, although they may be relatively expensive. We see our transportation system moving in the next decade or two into this upper right quadrant, where there will be mobility as a utility and a lot of shared ownership and shared vehicles. The challenge that this presents is to us a kind of equity issue between urban suburban communities and small rural communities, where a lot of the models that we've seen around mobility as a service and autonomous vehicles have tended to focus on urban conditions or metropolitan areas. And so we're concerned about the inequities that might arise as we go through this transportation revolution over the next decade or two in terms of how rural communities will be able to achieve mobility. And so that was one of the motives for doing this study, which is what are some of the innovations that we can think of for greater Minnesota communities, and what are the things that are happening right now? and there's a lot of need. I mean, this graph just kind of, this table just sort of shows the range of diverse needs in particularly rural communities, but really in any size community in terms of transit, in terms of people who may be too old to drive or should not be driving, people with physical disabilities, young people, adolescents. And I'll talk later about how the work we've been doing in Grand Rapids shows there's a huge demand for mobility as a service and autonomous shuttles in this adolescent age group. There can be, issues of households with too low an income to own a vehicle, or for various reasons, people temporarily lacking a vehicle and what have you. And so by some accounts, as much as 25% of the American public lacks mobility, is either not of a driving age or for various reasons can't drive themselves. And so we see that this shift in our transportation system is really a liberating thing for about a quarter of our population, and that it's particularly for an aging population, a good thing. And for other parts of the country that have a large number of young people, it's also a very good thing. And so, Minnesota and greater Minnesota particularly has a lot of challenges. It has, as the map on the right shows, it has an aging population. And so finding various kinds of transit alternatives for an increasingly aging population is really important. As well as the map on the left shows, there's a lot of time spent commuting. And so are there ways to share those commute responsibilities? Are there ways that people can leverage various kinds of resources available to them in order to reach their destinations? And then there's also a lot of vehicles in greater Minnesota, as the map on the left shows particularly. So we feel that one of the ironies in rural communities is that they don't have the density for a conventional transit system, but they have a lot of vehicles. And so what are the strategies that we can use to leverage all of that vehicular opportunity and potential that exists in these communities? And so with that, we also began to think about how is rural transit really primed for innovation. And in fact, we think that some of the things that are actually harder to implement in urban areas are possible in rural communities, in part because there's a lack of other options, and in part because, it seems to us, as we've worked in various greater Minnesota communities, they're much more open to trying things, particularly low cost, low risk kinds of options to a conventional transit system. And so that is really appealing to us. We think that this is where a lot of actual transportation innovation is going to happen in rural communities, maybe even before it happens in urban communities. And so this project worked with the leadership and the community of Wabasha, Minnesota, a community of a few thousand people on the Mississippi River, shown here. Has a very dynamic mayor and a lot of community support for thinking about transit in new ways. And so they were a kind of ideal partner on this project with us, and we couldn't have done it without them. And I think this also shows that there will be different levels of innovation occurring in different communities in rural settings. Some communities seem to be really open to trying things and open to innovation, others may not. And so I think part of this is recognizing that change will happen in fits and starts, and it'll happen at different speeds in different places. Just a little bit about Wabasha. It has an existing transit system, Hiawatha Land, which is an on-demand, on-call transit system. And like many greater Minnesota communities, there are limited hours and you have to call ahead. And so it requires a fair amount of planning in one's use of transit, but it does exist. So, that's certainly, a positive thing. And of course, there's also dial-a-ride service for people who elderly or people who might have a physical disability. So there are existing systems. But what we were interested in were this other ways in which people were getting around. Recognizing that rural transportation is really multifaceted, and that in addition to the sort of existing more conventional transit systems that are there, there's a whole range of other things that are going on that are more informal, that involve relationships that people have in rural communities. In fact, we think that this is one of the strengths of greater Minnesota communities and rural communities generally, is that there's a lot of social relationships among the people who live there, and that a lot of transit then can happen in a relational way rather than in the typically transactional way in which we run transit systems in urban and suburban areas. So, you know, one of the strategies we saw was a lot of people taking advantage of social media, and that this is far more prevalent than we even thought it would be. There was, for example, websites, in this case, this website, Wabasha Helping Wabasha, a whole range of rideshare groups that often were very specialized. For example, we found a whole rideshare group around people who are bringing stray dogs and cats to vet clinics to be spayed and neutered. We found lots of, you know, informal relationships among people who were, in the case of Wabasha, working in Rochester at the Mayo Clinic and needed rides, and had sort of structured a whole sort of rideshare commuting system informally through social media. And so I think that one of the ways we have to understand rural transit is that there's a lot of this happening kind of below the surface that isn't necessarily visible. And yet we have to recognize that it's happening, and actually sort of suggesting that this is something that communities could encourage. They could make this easier for their residents. There's also this issue of volunteer ridership, and we were just talking before this webinar about how there's a move afoot by our two senators in Congress to make the compensation for volunteer drivers better, to encourage more of this. There was a drop off during the pandemic, and a lot of volunteer drivers have not sort of come back to doing that. We're also doing right now putting in a proposal to do a pilot project in Crookston, Minnesota, and the other side of the state from Wabasha, where we're looking at a way to incentivize volunteerism through a community loyalty rewards program, where not only would a volunteer get better compensated for the driving of other people, but actually would get deep discounts in local stores. So it becomes a way to incentivize local businesses as well as local volunteerism. So thinking about how to encourage a system that already exists, and then this idea of, can there be central ride clearinghouses, a bit like the ride board that Lisa was talking about, but doing it digitally. Hitch is an example of many of these kinds of platforms that now exist for people to find rides, in the case of Hitch, between cities. And so again, these systems exist in rural areas as much as urban areas, and they are, I think, a great way for us to sort of build a transit system bottom up in a more incremental way. Again, the second strategy, as I mentioned, was leveraging the community connections that already exist in small towns. I was in a meeting the other day, and somebody said their transit system was, you know, networking with people after church to find out, you know, who needs rides, who's going where. So I think there's a lot of these kinds of transportation-related conversations that exist in small towns that, again, are quite effective. We're also seeing, in the case of like Amazon, beginning to sort of encourage more local delivery and enlisting people in the local delivery economy. And so I think that this is also a real opportunity for us to sort of constantly ask the question, how much do we have to move people to goods and services, and how much can we move goods and services to people? A lot of the research that I've done on the impact of pandemics on you know, the physical environment has shown that we, for really the first time in human history in this pandemic, realized that if you had a decent digital device and a good connection to the internet, that you could have virtually any good or service delivered either to your door or your device. And so this is a profound shift in how we think about transportation, where in fact, so much of it will be about moving things to people rather than moving people to things. And so, that is, I think, an idea that has great potential for rural communities. Again, this idea of tapping informal community networks that are already existing and making it easier so that anybody in a community could tap into these networks. And again, this, I think, could be a role, as we discussed with Wabasha, that the city could play. The city has virtually every city of any size has a website. And could that website be facilitating these kinds of connections of local transit needs? And then just again, building neighborhood networks. Nextdoor is an example of a platform that is now widely used for helping neighbors connect to neighbors on a whole range of things, but including transportation. So we think that there's a kind of a transformation in transit happening in the digital sphere that is often invisible to us. Another idea is, as I said earlier, is there's a lot of vehicles in greater Minnesota communities that are sitting around parked over 90% of the time. And so how might we leverage them? Platforms like Turo is a car sharing app. We were surprised to see there were a lot of people in Wabasha using Turo to either loan out their vehicle or to have access to a vehicle. And so how can we build on these existing apps and platforms? Developing bike sharing programs. This is the Public Bikes program in Wabasha, where there's a lot of underutilized bicycles in communities. We looked at how there could also be a program in the local high school around bike repair and maintenance, so that there could be a way in which the local K-12 educational system could be part of the process of maintaining this mode of transportation. And then, this idea of reimagining school buses. As we all know, it's getting harder and harder to find school bus drivers. It's not a particularly good job. It's not paid very well. And of course, you end up with a big hole in the middle of your day between the morning and afternoon transport of students. And is there a way for us to sort of think about these parked school buses in so many communities as another transit system? And that would have, of course, I think, require some change in regulation that specifies and limits the use of these vehicles for more general transit. However, we think that it could convert the bus driver job into a much better job, which would attract more bus drivers because it would be a full-time job rather than a job tied to the school day and school year. And we also think that this could be part of the 20% match that local communities could then have for state funding. And so we think there's a lot of opportunity here. And again, when you think about how this works in urban areas, school kids will take the Metro Transit bus to school. They don't all take school buses. And so, there is this tradition of youth taking transit that isn't necessarily just a school bus. And could we flip that in greater Minnesota communities where the school bus becomes the transit system? Another strategy was this whole idea of focusing on mobility itself and the various ways in which it can happen. We looked at strategies to create sidewalks where they might not exist in rural communities through sort of temporary bollards and restriping of streets so that you can kind of create sidewalks in the street right of way itself to encourage pedestrian activity. Can we sort of reimagine streets to be more adaptable? This is some work we've been doing, granted in an urban area, but this is easily done in a smaller town, which is to think about the street as a place for people that can be not only for various modes of transportation, but that can be easily closed off, used for community events. Because one of the reasons to do this is if your transit system is a relational system, the more we do to get neighbors to know each other and the community to come together, it actually enhances the possibility of there being transit as they form informal connections and utilize social media and what have you. And so the design of streets could actually enhance the digital connections that make it possible. And then, this idea of reducing the need for transit. This is a map of the sidewalks in Wabasha, and they're not very complete. There are a lot of streets without sidewalks. So how can we make it easier for people to get access to stores and other needs without having to rely on buses? And of course, many of these issues have to do with encouraging more infill, encouraging more compact development, more intense use of our existing infrastructure, and more mixed use land uses, so that we don't need to be traveling as much to get our needs met. There's a big movement globally around the 15-minute city, and many small communities are 15-minute cities. You can get to a store in 15 minutes. You can get to the library or city hall in 15 minutes. And so taking advantage of the compactness of smaller communities, we think, is also something that we should pay attention to. And then finally, we also suggested that there should be maybe a statewide strategy around this. This was just a logo that we suggested at the end of our report, which is to really focus on a whole set of strategies around transit in greater Minnesota that would emphasize that mobility and movement in more rural communities is different from urban and suburban communities, but maybe just as innovative and just as important and just as needed. As sort of the lead off to my next part of my talk, I just wanted to make the point that there's actually quite a lot of new technology that is occurring in rural communities. For example, with autonomous vehicles, some of the first vehicles that are going to have AV technology include autonomous combines and long distance trucking, which tend to be in rural areas. So we may actually see some of the earliest autonomy in vehicles in the countryside rather than in cities. But this idea of embracing new technologies is key. Of course, a big part of that is ensuring that there's high speed bandwidth access to the internet, a challenge that we're now facing. And there's certainly with the IIJA funding and other federal funding, a lot of movement in this direction. And then really also thinking about moving into that sort of upper quadrant in that image I showed earlier around autonomy. And I just want to end with the work that we've been doing in Grand Rapids, another small community in northern Minnesota, where this is the autonomous vehicle shuttle as part of the Go Marty project that MnDOT and CTS have been leading. And again, I think this shows that some of our first autonomous vehicle shuttles are not happening in the Twin Cities, they're happening in Rochester and in Grand Rapids. And again, where we think that there's a lot of opportunity for innovation to occur in these smaller communities where this is happening first. This is I'll just end with a little bit of what we did with the Grand Rapids community. This is a map of the autonomous vehicle shuttle routes to the various important destinations in the city, along with the stops. And what our team did is we looked at the mobility hubs that are part of these stops. And so we did a lot of community engagement. This is just a sort of a word cloud of what were the important issues for people. And of course, obviously, accessibility is a big part of that. And one of the things that we also saw is that there's a lot of interest in this, not only in the plus 65 age group, but a lot in the minus 18 age group, as well as obviously people who have other kind of physical disabilities. But actually, we discovered as this shuttle has been put into place that it's this under 18 group that had by far the greatest demand for this. And so what we did is we did a lot of research about what's happening with mobility hubs globally, and many of those have been done in urban areas. And so they were much more elaborate and frankly too expensive for a smaller community. So what we did is we took a lot of those capabilities and functions and boiled them down into a much more affordable, doable kind of system with a lot of kind of low tech and what we call mid tech kinds of strategies that would be affordable and sort of scaled properly to a small community. And the way in which these mobility hubs could be within parking spaces, existing right-of-ways, so that they take a minimum amount of space. And with a full range from the simplest to maybe the most elaborate. I mean, one of the things that we are seeing globally really is that mobility hubs are not just places to change modes of transportation, but they can be places to get access to the internet, to charge your phone, to charge your car, to have package deliveries occurring, so a whole, as well as information boards that could, for example, help you get access to other forms of transit. And so we think that this idea of providing places in small communities where a lot of these functions can be available to people is important. And I'll just end with a series of images that we did in Grand Rapids with community engagement around what this would actually look like on real streets, sort of with before and after, showing kind of the minimal way in which they can be kind of inserted into a parking lane within a city that allows for ADA access and up to this idea of a sort of information kiosk as part of the mobility hub, to a more elaborate one in maybe a denser part of a community where there's some shelter, package delivery, other forms of mobility, and then what this would look like sort of fully built out in a urban area. And so with that, I will end my comments. So thank you.
Very good, Tom. Thank you so much. There's a lot of information packed in there, and I'm sure people are starting to form some questions, but we'll hold those to the end. And Elliott, if you want to start your presentation, we'll listen to you for a while. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Give me just one moment here to load up. Okay. Thank you for having me here today. Again, my name is Elliott McFadden. I work in the Office of Transit and Active Transportation at the Minnesota Department of Transportation. I'm the Greater Minnesota Shared Mobility Coordinator. Today, I'm going to talk about our Mobility as a Service project, which is one of the two big projects that I have happening in the Greater Minnesota Shared Mobility Program. The other one was mentioned in my bio as Moving Greater Minnesota Forward, which is a shared mobility incubator. So really kind of building off some of the things that Tom was talking about, we have a program that helps communities grow from an idea development stage to a pilot testing stage to scaling a successful project to becoming a long-term service. Specifically focusing on rural, tribal, and small urban communities. So if you've got ideas that you're thinking about or bubbling up from maybe some of the things Tom presented, do check that out, Moving Greater Minnesota Forward. And we actually are going to next week be opening up enrollment for a summer cohort of idea development. So people who have ideas that they want to develop with us and can enter that and get the help developing their concept. But today I'll jump into how we are helping rural public transit gain more digital access in Greater Minnesota. So a little bit about market need for this. At MnDOT, we are committed to helping reduce the impact of greenhouse gas emissions coming from transportation. Public transit is a key part of that. But we know coming out of the pandemic, public transit has been slower to recover than many of the other forms of transportation. We did some research with Professor Yingling Fan during the pandemic at the University of Minnesota, looking at what were some of both safety and service improvements that could be implemented by public transit and shared mobility that could help recover ridership faster and restore confidence in public transit. And digital trip planning and payment were among the items that were identified that had significant interest, especially among those who don't currently use transit but are interested in using transit. And we know right now that the transit industry in general has been pretty slow to develop solutions for rural transit systems. So there's a lot of tech that's been developed for highly urbanized systems, but less so for rural. And so we are in the midst of wrapping up a mobility as a service pilot with the Federal Transit Administration. Just to define what that means, mobility as a service, or MaaS. It's a digital self-service platform. It's providing access to information on all your mobility options, allows trip planning, fare payment, and real-time updates where those are available. Public transit is the core service, but it is a multimodal platform. So we look at other services like private shuttles and buses, taxis and ride hail, and shared vehicles like bike, scooter, and car share, as well as emerging technologies like connected and autonomous vehicles. And we received 2 Federal Transit Administration grants that ended up partnering with 13 public transit agencies, intercity bus, and shared mobility providers in southern and western Minnesota. So you can see on the map the first grant, the Southern Minnesota MaaS project, and the second grant, the Western Minnesota Contactless Payment Project. They have slightly different research objectives, but the technology that was implemented was universal across this service area. We do have a couple of research teams that have been working on this. So from the University of Minnesota, you saw Assistant Professor Ali Reza Khani with Tom's project. He's also been working on research on both of these projects. For the Southern Minnesota project, has been doing modeling around MaaS and how it can impact both operational efficiencies and mode shift. And then his team is the independent evaluator for the Federal Transit Administration on the Western project. So doing field surveys and interviews and analysis of the technology that was being implemented on that project, which focused more on contactless payment systems. And then for our Southern Minnesota project, we have a second team with an entity called ICF, also in partnership with the University of California at Berkeley. And they are the independent evaluator for the Southern Minnesota project and doing field surveys, focus groups, and follow-up analysis on that as well. This is a very high level image of the mobility as a service platform and kind of highlight some of the things that we did that were innovative about this project. So in the center section in this purple, teal, and red box is the data that's coming from your different providers. So it could be operational software, it could be data feeds like the general transit feed specification, or it could be financial transactions. And traditionally on MaaS projects, what you would do is hire a consumer app. They would integrate all of this information and make it all work so that the public could do trip searches and be able to be on their way. What we've done differently is split out what's called the API management. So APIs are the conversations that happen between different software platforms. Those are those arrows that are going back and forth. And rather than having that connected to the consumer app, by splitting it out and managing that separately, it allows us to go off to this whole box on the right and be able to also share information with other apps and other providers. So this really opens us up as more of an open architecture, allowing data to flow where the public would like to see it and where we can create innovative new partnerships and business models with the project that we've created. We are working with a software vendor called Cambridge Systematics, who's our lead vendor and is doing the data integration. Transit app is our consumer-facing application. So if you download the Transit app today, which is a free app, you can see all of the transit information for the service area that we're talking about. There's a company called Trillium that is developing the general transit feed specification, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And then we have integrated ticketing with a company called Token Transit. So within the Transit app, with participating transit agencies, you can actually pay for fare as well as being able to do your searches and plan trips. So if we go back, we can see kind of how everybody fits into this general schematic. And then I'll jump into something a little more detailed, which shows how from the left side, moving right, you see all of the information coming from the different transportation providers. And this flows all into this orange box called a mobility hub. And it has some unique characteristics to it. This is one where we have kind of going from the bottom up, the data warehouse. So we can collect historical data that's happening off of the platform and be able to incorporate that into our data dashboard, which I'll show you here in a second, and be able to use that as a planning tool. We're also a feed aggregator. So all of the information coming from these different transit providers are coming into one place. So both the transit app as our app partner, but third-party apps as well as a web interface that we've built. Folks can be able to pull in from one spot. So you're not having to go to all of these individual transit agencies. App providers and travel planners can come to one spot. And then finally, we have this thing called OTP with GTFS Flex. So that's a little bit of alphabet soup. What that stands for is Open Trip Planner with the General Transit Feed Specification for Flexible Services. General Transit Feed Specification, or GTFS, is the technology that describes things like routes, timetables, fares, bus stops, and all the aspects of your travel that allows you to do trip planning on things like Google Maps and Apple Maps. There is a version of it called GTFS Flex, which was experimental. And we incorporated that into this project. Because it was experimental, none of the trip planners had really built their system around that. So we had an open source planning engine called Open Trip Planner, or OTP, that we built, which allows third-party apps to be able to not only consume the information, but be able to do the trip planning with this data. Excuse me. So luckily for us, as part of this project, the transit app decided that rather than use this trip planning engine, they would go ahead and program their native search engine to consume Flex data as well. So that enhanced the adoption of GTFS Flex. But essentially what this is doing is packaging everything to make it really easy for third-party apps to be able to consume data. And Flex is really important because almost all rural transit services are either what we call demand response, so that's a dial-a-ride system, or deviated route service, which is a fixed route, but you deviate off of it if you call ahead. And those services aren't described by the base GTFS that we've been using for over a decade. So those services around the country don't show up on trip planners at all. So we have hundreds of agencies, thousands of transit services that are invisible to the public today. So that's why it was really important to develop this data standard. One of the things we did on the project was develop GTFS feeds for all the participating transit agencies. Many of them did not yet have this technology developed, especially with the emerging GTFS Flex. As I mentioned, Transit app actually was the first major trip planning app to include Flex data in their trip planning engine for demand response and things like ADA paratransit services. And our use of this has actually led to the official adoption by the transit agency of this Flex standard. So in March, the entity that is the steward of this specification called a vote, and it was unanimous, and it was actually the largest stakeholder vote ever in the organization's history, and it was unanimously adopted. And what this now means is this gives us the basis for other planners like Apple, Google, things like Move It app and things like that to be able to start incorporating these flexible routes and really allow the public to see a complete picture of all the services that are available. In addition, we also focused on developing a new emerging data standard called the Demand Response Transactional Data Specification. So data specs are really important and standards because it allows more interoperability. If we're all speaking the same digital language, which is what a specification is, it makes it easier for any software system to be able to interact with it. So the demand response transactional data specification does what GTFS does, but applies it to actual trip bookings. And I'll talk about that in a minute as an integration that we've done. But it's really kind of making that complete picture from trip planning to booking to arrival of a vehicle. So we're creating the whole route, whole trip experience on this platform for riders. Just to give you some examples of what these services look like now within the Transit app. In blue, you see a deviated route service in Albert Lee. So there's a fixed route, but they'll deviate off that if you call ahead. So you can now see that bubble where they'll do that. And then in red, we have True Transit, which is a rural provider that is provides service around in the counties surrounding Mankato. But it's interesting, this is very sophisticated in the way it can show different service types that are available. So True Transit will go point to point and pick you up and drop you off within their service area, but they'll also pick you up and take you into Mankato, or pick you up from Mankato and take you back to their service area, but they don't do point to point within Mankato because Mankato has their own public transit service. So with that little hole in the middle, you can see how these services work. And if you put in a connection with True Transit, that isn't available, then that option isn't going to show up. And as of today, all of the agencies have the option to do what we call book by phone. So that allows you to connect through your mobile device actually to the call center where you can make a demand response reservation. But as I'll talk about here in a second, we've added for some participating agencies the ability to book as well. As I mentioned, we have a purchasing, a fare payment integration with a company called Token Transit. Not every agency opted for this, but about half of the agencies decided to add this as an option. So it's integrated within the Transit app. It is what's called visual validation. So you make a purchase of a ticket, you activate it, and there's some animation that shows up on the screen that allows the driver to see that it's a valid ticket. It also sets a time where the ticket will be able to expire after a certain period of time, so you can't reuse the ticket. And it's a very simple, elegant way of deploying that, in that you don't need any special equipment. You just need a little bit of training for the drivers. And that's a free setup with just a service fee for transactions that agencies pay. As I mentioned, we developed also a web trip planner in addition to the Transit app to allow folks who don't have access to a mobile device to be able to do trip planning. This allows us also to do more testing of that Open Trip Planner search engine, which drives this site. And you can see here in Mankato some different options, including option 3, where it says must call ahead, which is a flexible service. And then I also mentioned that we are collecting information. So we have aggregate data about where people are searching for trips, as well as matching up with historic transit data and usage data. So transit agencies can use this as a planning tool to be able to see maybe where demand for trips is happening, where maybe they don't have service today. And then the final bit of technology, which is I think the most exciting, is our ability to do integrated booking. So with 3 agencies, Rolling Hills Transit, the Otter Express, which is in Western Minnesota, so those are 2 rural agencies, and with the ADA Paratransit service for Rochester Public Transit. Those services today, you now can plan a trip, be able to, instead of call to book, hit a book online button, and that pulls all of your trip information in and submits that to the transit agency, allows them to either accept or deny that ride, and then for you to be able to visualize what was happening with your rides coming up, as well as do some trip management. As I mentioned, we're using this emerging data standard called the Demand Response Transactional Data Specification. So this is really focused on more of how do you standardize how we share information back and forth with different systems on a trip. And we focused very much on the trip side of things, although we do have the ability in the future to do more financial and operational data as well. This is just a quick show of the screens, the booking screen, kind of your management screen here in the middle where you can see what's going on with your trip, be able to cancel that and be informed about cancellation policies, and then finally be able to see all of your upcoming trips, what the status is, and be able to go in and see in more detail. As of today, we can, that can change. You put in a requested time, you can see updated scheduled times once your booking has been accepted. But we are working on kind of as the next step to add real-time arrival information as a future part of this. And just to show you that this is a very open platform here as well, it really doesn't matter. You know, we have today a software system called TripMaster with these 3 transit agencies that's in this red box, the transit app here in the green box, and this booking client and web integration that sits on top of the transit app that talks between the systems. But it is really open, and because we use a universal language to exchange data, really any software provider can plug into this system. So a little bit on the calendar. So we started work on this back in May of 2020. I'm sorry, 2022. We launched the trip planning and ticketing in March of last year, the web-based trip planner in August, and in January of this year, the demand response booking. And our pilot with the Federal Transit Administration actually ends today. Today is the last day of that pilot. However, we have invested to continue maintaining the system and are looking at some opportunities to continue to improve and expand it. So this whole project was part of an evaluation that we were doing for a potential statewide deployment, trying to understand the benefits of the technology, and we're still waiting for those kind of final reports from the research team, but that'll help make decisions moving forward as we're making investment in transit in Greater Minnesota. We also think there are potential for looking at how we standardize information around billing and financial transactions, as well as data integrations with non-emergency medical and social service delivery in the coming years. And then also, how do we fit this into the larger landscape of parking, tolling, distance-based fee as a potential replacement for the gas tax? And really where this platform can go is to see all of your transportation options, be able to do things like mobility wallets and be able to create incentives for mode shift, and dynamic pricing and things like that. So that's a very exciting future that we see for MaaS. Some of the opportunities that we're pursuing right now, where we have a grant pending with the Minnesota Technology Modernization Fund that would add real-time arrival information to that demand response booking, as well as a web integration, so that right now it's just in the transit app, but being able to do those bookings through a web page as well. And then looking at a second proposal to expand this platform statewide. And then we also have a federal grant application pending that's looking at an integration with intercity bus. And one of the nice things that we've done with the architecture and the way we've built this is we're not dependent on a single app. So in this case, this proposal is looking at using the booking system that already exists for Jefferson lines and being able to integrate local transit data into that reservation system, so that when somebody is making a trip reservation through intercity bus, they can see connecting transit services. And if it's a rural provider with demand response, use that booking module to be able to actually put in and book that connecting trip, so they can make their complete trip all in one place, as well as pay for it. And we also see an opportunity to take more of this technology that we've done and create an open license for it for other transit agencies around the country, so they can do similar kinds of integrations as well. And with that, we'll wrap up and turn